My name is Brittany Kennedy, and I'm a senior professor of practice in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at Tulane University. And today I'm going to be talking to you about king cake. What I'm going to talk to you today about is a little bit about the history of king cake, where it comes from, and why specifically here in New Orleans there seems to be so many different types of king cake. Um, the thing to know about king cake specifically is that it's not actually native to New Orleans. There are many traditional cakes associated with Carnival. The two that perhaps have most informed our king cake tradition here are the Roscon de Reyes and the Galette du Roi. So there, traditionally, you would eat these on Epiphany, January 6th, which is when Carnival officially begins. It marks the period between Epiphany and the beginning of Lent on Ash Wednesday, with Mardi Gras Day being the day before Ash Wednesday that you celebrate. The king cake traditionally comes from sort of a pagan tradition. Originally, a small bean was put inside of it. With Christianity, that bean becomes either a small porcelain figure in the French tradition, or here in New Orleans, we put a small plastic baby inside. Although we don't often put it inside, you notice it's on the outside because the Food and Drug Administration mandated that we do that so that people wouldn't choke on it. But it's still tradition that you would hide the baby inside the king cake, and the person who gets the baby has to buy the next king cake, right? So it's unsurprising. Where does the king cake come from? The French and the Spanish are the ones that colonized New Orleans, and so it's actually Basque settlers. The Basque Country is a small little community that is nestled on the border between Spain and France, and it's those settlers that bring king cake to New Orleans in 1718. It's not popularized really until the 1870, and it's popularized by the French. I should note the documentation on this is really, really murky. There's not a lot of evidence in the archives really about this. Most of what we know about king cake history is coming from the bakeries themselves and advertisements. And even I, I consider myself a king cake enthusiast, have not had the opportunity or found a lot of documentation outside what you just find on Google to prove this. It makes sense. There were a tremendous amount of bestsellers in colonial New Orleans. It makes sense straddling the border between Spain and France that those settlers would bring what is traditionally a brioche based cake dough here to New Orleans. But where king cake goes from there is a very, very different place. It's traditionally a cinnamon-based brioche dough, either topped with a glaze, right? Or with sugar. So similar probably in style, more similar in style to the Roscon de Reyes than the Galette du Roi. So what I like to tell people, the next question is immediately people ask when they come to New Orleans is why are there so many different types of king cake? And what I'm going to kind of argue today is that if you look at the history of king cakes and you look at the different types of king cakes, what you're going to see is sort of a progressive development of New Orleans history, particularly the migration of the various communities within the city that have come into the city and then settled in specific areas and neighborhoods and opened bakeries. So New Orleans was a French and Spanish colony. The French culturally have a much bigger role here. They popularized the king cake in the late 19th century. When New Orleans is bought by the Americans, our Americanization is sort of an uneven process. People speak French well into the 20th century. We have French newspapers, we have French radios. It's World War II that really creates a much more American identity in the city of New Orleans, and we start self-identifying more as Americans. And with that, the king cake becomes more Americanized. You still find traditional brioche cakes. In fact, I think one of the most traditional people who talk about real king cake, authentic king cake, what they tend to think of is a traditional cinnamon brioche dough topped with a sugar glaze and crystallized sugar and nothing else. And that changes as American cooking styles change in the 1950s with technology. Baking at home becomes more of a thing, and also the making of sweeter doughs, lighter doughs, icings, decorations, that enters into the king cake. Also, we have a large Sicilian population here in the city that post-World War II moves out to the suburbs and begins to open bakeries. And they, in many ways, I think, are responsible for Americanizing the king cake by incorporating icing This is when you start seeing sprinkles. Bakeries like Gambino's and Randazzo's, which are today much beloved king cakes, right, are major Italian bakeries, and you see king cakes with icing and sprinkles. And this is when you also start seeing fillings in king cakes. And there are as many king cake fillings as there are well, just about anything else. So this is where you see cream cheese, right? Lots of jelly fillings. A lot of people seem to describe king cake as this type of king cake as a cross between a cinnamon roll and a jelly donut. It is very sweet. It's very, very sweet, and they're good, right? Another, I think, great example of immigrant communities that have changed the king cake landscape, I think irrevocably, is after the Vietnam War. The Catholic Church here encourages Vietnamese refugees to settle here in New Orleans, and they settle in two major communities. One is in New Orleans East, and one is on the west bank of the city, right? And so you have two major bakeries that come out of this. One is Dong Feng Bakery, which is famous for their bread in general. And as of about 10 years ago, they started making a king cake, and it is sort of a blend of, it is a brioche-based dough, but one that's folded with the cinnamon. They do have fillings, and it's topped with a almost savory cream cheese, highly whipped frosting. A couple of years ago, the internet got a hold of this narrative, and these king cakes became much sought after. They're still sought after as of right now, primarily because of the COVID pandemic. You cannot actually go to Dong Feng and get a king cake. They have sold out for the amount of spots for the year that they have time slots to pick it up. You have to get it from one of their authorized resellers. The closest one near campus is Adams Street Grocery, and they sell out usually before 10 a.m. in the days leading up to Mardi Gras. It is perhaps one of the best king cakes. I personally think it's one of the best king cakes in New Orleans. The opposite side of that on the West Bank is Hido Bakery. And theirs is a traditional brioche topped with cinnamon. I'm sorry, topped with sugar cake. They do fill them. Their most famous filling is their apple filling, and also a wonderful bakery, but and still a Vietnamese bakery, but totally different approach. Vietnam, as we know, were colonized by the French, and so you certainly see the French influence in this baking practices, even in the Vietnamese bakeries that are located in New Orleans, right? In the period post-Katrina, king cakes change even more. We have more people coming into the city. We have transplants, people who are not generally from here and don't necessarily have such a strong idea of what a king cake is supposed to be. And so you start seeing in the period post-Katrina new immigrant populations coming into the city, and then just new people in general who have their own take on king cake. So I'm going to give you some of the more bizarre examples of that. The first one being the king cake burger, which is not available this year because it was done by a food truck, but it made its way a couple of years ago and was met with a combined reaction of adoration and horror. As someone who's had it, I can tell you it actually is pretty good. It was good, but it's not something you want every day, right? Recently this year, the Iliad supermarket, which is a Latin American supermarket, there's several of them located throughout the city, very much a representation of the increased Latin population that came to New Orleans post-Katrina to help the city rebuild. This year, they released a tres leches king cake, which is sort of a cinnamon-based tres leches king cake, and and they just decorated in purple, green, and gold. Also had it, very good. Very sweet. It both tastes like tres leches king cake, and it tastes like king cake. And there you have it. That's where they are. So this is a very brief talk, but what I've kind of wanted to leave you with today is this idea that king cake as this ideal form. When people ask you what is king cake or what is that, the immediately they're going to tell you is their favorite king cake, right? And whatever people tell you is their favorite king cake is less a reflection of what they like the best. Sometimes it is, sometimes you just like a certain king cake, and tells you more about who they are and what their relationship is to the city, what group, what socioeconomic group, what immigrant group, what neighborhood they grew up in, right? What is interesting about king cake, and I think particularly interesting in the post-COVID landscape, is that we are a city that is supporting a ton of bakeries. And part of the reason these bakeries manage to survive is because they make so much money during king cake season. During the season, it's absolutely typical that a person brings king cake to the office, and because of the tradition that when you get the baby you buy the next king cake, the average office has between 5 and 6 king cakes a week leading up to Mardi Gras season, meaning that the bulk of the bakeries in the city make about 70 to 80% of their profits during carnival. So in a post-COVID landscape where people aren't bringing king cakes to office because of social distancing and staying at home, it'll be really interesting to see what happens to these bakeries and how they move forward. An example of this is a king cake that I'm going to show you right now, which is Cake Cafe. And Cake Cafe was a wonderful bakery in the Marigny, and they actually closed down post-COVID because they couldn't make it as a diner or bakery or cafe. But they are actually making king cakes this season and selling them, including by the slice, through French Truck Coffee. Um, and a last roundabout that I kind of want to give a shout out to is that another manifestation of this is that we have also decided to re-remember a French past in a contemporary New Orleans landscape. And the traditional galette de roi does appear in New Orleans. Maple Street Patisserie, really close to campus, sells them. Also, the bakery La Boulangerie, which is on Magazine, sells them as well as a couple other bakeries on campus. That is actually a post-Katrina phenomenon too, by and large, right? So whenever anybody says, what's your favorite king cake? Or why do you like king cake? Or what is king cake? Always remember that they're bringing in this cultural, historical, geographical baggage that is absolutely going to inform what they're going to think king cake is. And that the older I get and the more king cake I eat, I've eaten, and I've eaten a lot in my life, the more that I think that getting into one idea of what king cake should be is perhaps limiting. And I welcome the king cake interpretations that we've seen recently, and that hopefully we'll see moving forward. I hope you all have a happy and safe Mardi Gras, and thanks so much for hearing me talk.